And welcome to the Road from Emmaus podcast. I'm your co-host, Cron Morgan, along with fellow co-host Kit Culver. Our goal each week, each episode, is to take you on a guided tour of redemptive history, showcasing the beauty, splendor, and unity of God's amazing story of cosmic redemption, restoration, and renewal. We hope that our warm conversational tone and format make an unfamiliar topic for many and intimidating for some very approachable, accessible, and digestible, growing and edifying the body. This is our fifth episode in our Journey Through the Scripture series. For those new to the podcast, our discussion format each week will be to respond to the discussion questions embedded at the bottom of the study notes document. You can find this linked in the podcast description box. In the same box, you'll also find a link to our website, roadfromemmaus.com, where we share a bit about ourselves, the genesis of our podcast name, and provide several helpful resources to help you dig further into redemptive history, no matter where you are in your journey. From time to time, Kit and I will also respond to direct questions listeners pose to us that fit a current topic. You can also reach us at contact@roadfromemmaus.com. Before we jump in, make sure you subscribe to our YouTube podcast and hit the bell for notifications so that you can receive fresh content when it drops. We will also drop a new episode every Monday morning, so be on the lookout for that. And we hope that you come on this exciting ride with us as we journey through the scriptures. We want to jump right in today, too. And once again, our topic and focus is going to be the significance and effects of the fall of sacred space. We've really been building a launch pad, so to speak, as we move outside of the garden over the last couple of weeks. And so we want to be mindful of these things and then always take it back to the creational account and ask ourselves, what is going on? Why is it going on? And then ultimately, how do these things find their fulfillment in Jesus Christ as we move throughout this narrative? With that context in mind, our first question this week is to really wrestle with what is the purpose and significance of the first gospel being intentionally embedded in God's pronounced judgment on the serpent Satan, and how does this answer the human and creational dilemma that resulted from man's sin?
Well, I think as we've mentioned before, you can't really understand the solution to something, or maybe even to put it more narrowly in terms of this idea of a first gospel. We can't understand what it is that God is even promising, what he's intending to fix, if we don't know what's gone wrong. And too often people will come to Genesis 3 and they'll read the account of God's pronouncing of a curse on the serpent and a curse on the ground and reach certain conclusions about what God is doing and what he's promising. But it's very important to read chapter 3 of Genesis in the light of chapters 1 and 2. And we've spent a fair amount of time talking about how the creation account in both of the first two chapters of Genesis lays the foundation for understanding even what the human creature is, and specifically man as the image of God, speaking to man's function in relation to God and God's creation, man as the mediator, administrator of that relationship. And so we have to understand this thing we call the fall, and then God's remedy in the light of that functionality, that purpose for which God created man. So when we talk about first gospel, that's often referred to as the proto-evangelium, and that's that promise that comes in the midst of God cursing the serpent, that he's going to put enmity between the seed of the serpent and the seed of the woman. And there will be this conflict such that each will end up bruising the other. But there is a distinction in terms of that bruising, in that the seed of the woman will bruise the head of the serpent, whereas the seed of the serpent will bruise the heel of the seed of the woman. And so there's a distinction even there. But I guess at this point, what I'm trying to get at is that the promise of God, first gospel, the good news is that God is promising to undo what has happened because of this thing of eating of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. And that's what we've discussed the last couple of weeks, the significance of that. So essentially, this first gospel being situated in that place is saying that it's in order to put things the way God would have them to be, undo this creational curse, God is going to have to deal with the serpent, who was the agent of that. There is a cursing upon him that has also led to the cursing of the ground. And so by God speaking this good news that will pertain to a bruising of the serpent, there's the implication that the enticement of the serpent, the error, the corruption that has come because of that seduction of the serpent, that too will be undone. So there's the hint that this is going to involve creational renewal.
And I think something else for our listeners to keep in mind, Kid, is I think during that episode, and in particular that exchange, the first gospel, so much focus is placed on Satan. And I think a lot of even pop culture, unfortunately, informs how we perceive and even engage Satan too, and pitchfork and tail and horns and this and that. How can we maybe guard against that, Kid, and really make sure that we're clearly seeing that episode and the implications for what they are?
Well, you're right. There is a lot of kind of pop culture and even a medieval tradition of how do we understand Satan, going back to even Dante's Inferno and a lot of this imagery and the art and um, the writings of the medieval period. And really from Genesis 3, we don't get a lot of clarity concerning this entity that is called the Satan. Fundamentally, that Hebrew word Satan simply means a questioner or a naysayer. Negatively, it can be an accuser, but it can simply be like a person who cross-examines. You see that idea in Job, where God is present with this council, and Satan comes along with the sons of God and appears before God. And he becomes a person who raises questions about God's assessment of Job and the righteousness of Job. So the Satan idea isn't necessarily a negative one, but biblically it becomes more and more representative of a negative power or a contradicting power, ultimately a power that works against God and his truth and his intent for his creation, fundamentally by influencing human beings who sit at the center of that divine plan. If God can, if the Satan, if this opposing power can cause man to stray from or relinquish his own created nature and function, then that brings into jeopardy the whole of the creation and God's relationship with it. And that's what you see in the fall. The text, God doesn't there say you, Adam and Eve, are cursed, but the cursing of the serpent also means the cursing of the ground. There is now enmity between the non-human created order and God because of the alienation that's come between God and his human creature that mediates that relationship.
Yeah, I think a lot of our listeners would be surprised to hear that even in his alienated state, man retains an awareness of God and desires to encounter him. What evidence do we have to that effect, first of all, too? Because that's a pretty bold statement. I know there's a pretty large camp that feels like the fall just totally annihilated man. That like there is no recovery, there's no redemption, that like man is forever separated from a holy God, too. And then also, if that is true, what we're proclaiming there, Kit, what are the consequences of this disquiet that kind of we're referencing and how they are manifest in people's daily existence?
Well, the first thing that we see after this, what we call the fall, this failure of man with respect to his relationship with God, as we talked, I think, last time, is this thing of exile. The man and the woman are expelled from the garden constituting sacred space, the place where the divine human encounter and relationship take place. And through that relationship, the mediating of God's lordship over the earth through the human being. And so the expulsion of man and the cutting off of man from access to the life of God represents this thing called the fall, or what is the nature of the human problem. And so man is consigned to death, both as the loss of or the forfeiture of immortality. You know, that man is consigned to his mortality. He's cut off from the tree of life. But he's also dead in terms of dead to his own nature and function because of the fact that he is the image and likeness of God. But that doesn't mean that man ceases to be the image. He is the image of God. He doesn't just bear it as some kind of added feature that can be stripped away from him. So really, human beings would have to cease to exist for the image of God to die with respect to them. Well, what that means is that even in this state of alienation, human beings still retain in their very being a kind of connectedness with God. But now it's at a distance. It's in the context of alienation and estrangement. Man is left to, in a sense, conceive of and reach out to and interact with God on his own terms in his own right. Remember that the tree of the knowledge of good and evil represents man taking to himself the right to think and act and judge independently of God. And that means that now even his conception of God, his way of envisioning, interacting with God, worshiping God, relating to God, all of that now comes through his own mind as it exists in estrangement with God. So human beings are now left to, in a sense, do business with deity or, gods or spiritual forces as they conceive them on their own terms. And the way that we see that dynamics is present is the first thing that happens, really recorded after the expulsion from the garden, is the birth of a son, Cain, and another son, Abel, who immediately, it kind of says, at the end of days or upon a certain time, they come and they bring an offering to God. So there is this thing of still seeking to worship God, even in the context of being banished from this relationship of intimacy with him. But there is also that kind of fearfulness and uncertainty. The first thing that happens with the fall is what? Adam and Eve hide. They're afraid. They're now afraid of God. And so even our approach to God in this condition is one of trepidation and fear and a sense of danger or perhaps even condemnation or whatever. And so that's the disquiet that you're talking about. And people are left in this kind of quandary of being instinctively drawn to seek out God and yet really being afraid of him, not knowing him, not really understanding who he is, and not knowing really what they're going to encounter when they do meet with him in that way.
Indeed. And I think something else that is interesting too is the irony, kid, is that man now in his estranged state, given his autonomous wisdom, now perceives religion as permanent, right? In other words, his confidence, this mannish distance, and as I alluded to earlier, even begins to doubt and question the very thing that he can't revoke, that he can annihilate, which is this image, right? Too. And so it's ironic how just even in this estranged state, what is true becomes false and what is false becomes true, right? And so, like, I think that even speaks to our next question, Kit, too, is though often overlooked, why is it important to identify and affirm the worship commonalities between Abel and Cain? And before you respond, Kit, I think something that people often who read through that episode, because they come to it, as we've talked about it, from their own cultural river and their perception, they fail to realize, too, in light of what we've already built, the first couple of chapters, that God has set up a kingdom on this idea of a interdependent life. And then that is now in contrast to this idea of autonomous wisdom. And so, given the fact that we have those two lines of thinking, it stands to reason that that should also play out as we advance and move through the rest of it. Can you maybe speak to that, Kit, too? Because I think a lot of people at their core feel it's almost of, well, so and so brought hamburger helper, so and so brought a steak, therefore one was better than the other. And that's like the end of like their analysis when it comes to the offerings.
Right, right. And commonly you read that the reason why God was pleased with Abel's offering and not was Cain's was that Abel brought a blood offering.
Right.
Cain brought a grain offering, an offering of plant products, the fruit of the ground in that sense. Well, two problems with that. Number one, grain offerings or meal offerings in that sense were as much a part of what God required of Israel as blood offerings, so to speak. And so there's no inherent betterness in one than the other. God doesn't say, I don't want anything in terms of grain offerings or produce offerings. I just want blood offerings. And the other thing too is that it's anachronistic, and that word means simply reading things out of the chronology or putting things outside of their chronology, out of order. And so what we're really doing when we say that is we're somehow implying that from the very beginning, God had given some sort of commandment concerning blood offerings, because there was no law of Moses at this time. There's no priesthood. There's no sacrificial system. So we can't read that back onto this as if they're Israelites somehow doing this offering. And they're, in fact, the commonality is that they are two boys, two young men who of their own volition decide to bring an offering to God. And they bring to him, in a sense, what they believe to be pleasing. They both bring an offering in the context of, again, an altar and a place of encounter. And what the text says is the difference between them comes down to ultimately the attitude or the mindset behind that. God is not pleased with Cain and his offering. And you see it also in the idea of the first and the best, the fatlings, whereas Cain just brings part of, some of the offering of the ground or whatever. But they did bring what was appropriate to them, because the one is a shepherd and the other is a tiller of the soil. So they're bringing the fruit of their own labors. But the text is indicating that the problem that God has is with Cain himself and his attitude in his heart, not the fact that he didn't bring a blood offering.
Indeed, two key concepts, I guess, for lack of better terms, that certainly emerge during the creation account are that of sacrament and symbolism. How do these point to the new reality of the post-Eden divine human relationship, and how do they serve as God's appointed stopgap in the progressive unfolding and escalation of redemptive history? Something that we've really been speaking to over the last several weeks.
Right. Well, it is significant that you don't see anything about offerings or altars until after what we call the fall, until the expulsion from Eden. And right away, we see that come into the picture. Cain and Abel are now bringing offerings in accordance with, an altar setting, a place where they think they're going to encounter God. And that should tell the reader that something substantial has happened. Man is still worshiping God, but the immediacy, the naturalness, the intimacy, the spontaneity, the kind of continuity of life with God in an intimate way is now gone. There's this need of a sense of an approach to a place with a certain thing in hand. And that's the sacrament and symbolism idea. You have now entities or articles of worship, altars, offerings, rituals. You now have holy rites, sacraments, things by which people can now seek to approach God. And either they do that and construct that on their own, or they're told to do it a certain way. And the thing that it speaks of fundamentally is this idea of mediated distance. Man is now having to make an approach to God through this thing of symbols and sacraments, because he doesn't have that immediacy with God. And this becomes the way in which human beings now, in the context of the fall, will continue to act and interact with God, even though at this point God has not commanded this. This is just the spontaneous way that these two human beings are thinking about how they can connect with God. But God will actually canonize this, if we can put it this way, through the prescription of a very complex and comprehensive worship system that we call the Levitical system that he will give to Israel. So Israel, even in their covenant intimacy with God, will still be worshiping him through this thing of mediated distance, through the use of symbols and sacraments, entities manipulated, offered, ordered in a certain way through certain rituals, in order for the worshiper to have access to God.
Indeed, indeed. Kid, as we kind of close up for our episode for the day, one of the things that I know our listeners are probably wondering too, and I think I've even wrestled with too, just throughout the years, is so much of the creational account is seen in a negative light in terms of great, okay, like there was a brokenness, there was a fall, there was a lostness, whatever you want to call it. But why was repair a wholly insufficient resolution to the creational curse? And then I think even a deeper question too is why was renewal required, specifically a glorious restoration brought about by an image son possessing true wisdom and might?
Well, certainly the answer of why renewal instead of repair kind of becomes obvious when we understand the nature of the problem, the calamity, what really happened. Um, if we don't understand how deeply and how thoroughly, and how irreparably, if we can put it that way, the human creature was impacted by this thing we call the fall, then it seems as if you can just kind of clean him up and fix things and kind of straighten some things around and get some things put back in order, and everything will be fine. But the text wants you to see that this, and largely through this idea of exile and the imposition of death, this becomes a calamity that only God himself can resolve, because it becomes the need of life out of death. And yet the promise to Eve, even in Adam naming her Eve, the mother of all the living, Adam recognizes that the promise of a triumph regarding the serpent that will come through a seed of the woman, that the result of that will be life out of death. And that becomes another major thematic thread that will move through the scripture, is that God, in putting this all back together, in restoring what's been lost, it really is an issue of bringing life out of death. And that's something that human beings are incapable of doing. Religion is a way to, in a sense, kind of shore things up or clean things up, or put a human supposedly on a different foothold with God. But in the end, the actual problem is something that only God can solve. And yet, interestingly, that resolution, that restoration that is life out of death, is entrusted to, or will come through, a human being. As much as it is God's work, God has assigned it to a human being. It is a seed of the woman through whom life out of death will come. And that becomes, again, another key foundational theme that will build and develop as things move on. And we see that even in the fact of Genesis being partitioned around 10 generation sections. These are the generations of the Toledoth, the generation section. And that becomes a structural way that Genesis is partitioned. And so we first have the generations of the heavens and the earth. And then we have the generations of Adam. And then we have the generations of Noah, and then of Noah's sons, and then specifically one son, Noah's sons, because they're the new humanity. And we'll get to that. But then specifically one son, Seth. And then from Seth, we move to Terah, the father of Abraham. And then we have the covenant and non-covenant descendants of the covenant man, Abraham, Ishmael, Isaac, Esau, and Jacob. So even the storyline itself is being carried through human lines. A covenanted human line and a non-covenanted human line. And that is, again, building on this theme that ultimately God is going to work in and through human beings to put all things right. But this rightness is going to be more than just a polishing up. It's not the Joni Mitchell song, Woodstock, we got to get back to the garden where, what happened in the garden, the original creation, as we talked, was the starting point. It was not the consummate end point. And so if we can put it this way, Christ as the new Adam is not just the old Adam restored from the fall. He is man as consummately man.
Mhm.
Adam unfallen was not man as consummately man. And at the center of that is this work and role of the Spirit, which is beyond where I want to go today. So where we were with mankind before the fall is not where God is ultimately going with this. The restoration, my point is, the restoration is greater than just cleaning off the dirt or the corruption of the fall. Adam, as created, wasn't consummately human. He wasn't the consummate man. That awaited the coming of this seed of the woman. So this restoration is unto a consummation that is greater than even the unfallen order of things.
Yeah, like I think if there was one thing that I would pull through everything you just said is just like the relational foundation of not only estrangement, but also restoration. And I think one of the things too that I think we're really trying to push our listeners on is just to understand that all of this happens within the cosmic scope. Because even
Right,
as you're talking, I think it's very easy for people to naturally just zoom back in. Great, he's talking about me, when in fact, too, is these things have always had a corporate and a cosmic scope to them. So
right,
even this idea of like relational estrangement, that doesn't just extend to us as human beings, that is to the cosmos itself too, is but also too is as those things come, and to your point, are taken under the lordship of that consummate image son too, is the cosmos itself, not just us as human beings, right, who happen to live in Denver or St. George. Those
right.
things are now taken under that lordship and then find their true rest and reconciliation as well too. And so we hope that this has been encouraging. We hope too that this time has also been profitable. Once again, don't forget to check out our website and subscribe to our YouTube podcasts. Please make sure that you not only subscribe, but you hit the bell for notifications so that you can be notified every Monday when we drop new content. We look forward to you joining us for the next episode. For Kit, I'm Farhan, and we'll see you down the road.